Hello and welcome to our case study. We'll be talking today about the secondary residence tax case in the Constitutional Court of Germany. So the case concerns a decision by the First Senate of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany in January of 2014. The two parties are the complainant versus the city of Constance, which acts as the defendant. And it relates to the imposition of a secondary residence tax on the complainant's apartment in the city of Constance between 2002 and 2006. The complainant objected against the defendant's tax, saying that it was digressive, and the case then went on to the administrative court, which was dismissed. It went to the higher administrative court, which also dismissed it, and then finally it reached the Federal Constitutional Court in 2009, and this is the decision that they made. So the two legal issues at hand here are, and we will only be focused on the first one, which is the digressive tax scale for secondary residences. Basically, what the complainant argues is that there's a violation of the fundamental right to equality enshrined in Article 3, Section 1 of the Basic Law in Germany. Basically, what this principle of equality says is that differences in treatment between people has to be justified in a proportionate manner. And here the complainant believes that this is not the case. So basically, what we're talking about here is a digressive tax. And as we can see here, as compared to a regressive tax, which occurs when the tax rate remains the same even as income increases, in a digressive tax scale, we see at first a proportionate increase of the marginal tax rate as income increases, but then when the tax rate becomes flat, we will see a decrease in the marginal tax rate, because whilst income is increasing, and the tax payable remains flat, the percentage of tax paid will decrease. So here we can see this illustrated. There are two tax brackets in this case. These are the 1989 bylaws, and then there's also the 2002 and 2006 bylaws. So here we see, first of all, that the basis for the tax paid is the annual rental expense on the residency. And here we can see that there's 5 brackets, and the tax amount is due on the right. So the tax amounts due are fixed, irrespective of where you are in the tax bracket. So there are five tax brackets, and as we see, there's an increase in the tax amount due. But just to illustrate why the complainant is arguing that this is digressive, a rental expense of 2,360 euros will lead to a 34% of tax amount paid as a percentage, whilst in the same bracket, someone who is paying a rental expense of 3,150 euros will be paying the same amount of tax, 818 euros, but as a percentage, it will be much lower. It will be around 26%. So these are the 2002 and 2006 bylaws, which were increased to 8 different brackets.
Okay, so now Oscar and I will explain the legal reasoning of the court, which will follow a 3-step assessment analysis. So first, the assessment of a possible constitutional violation, and second, an analysis of the justification for any violation, and third, the assessment of the proportionality of the legislation. So before identifying any constitutional violations, it is essential to understand that, generally speaking, constitutions often impose specific limitations on these types of taxes, which can then be enacted. So, for instance, the German Constitutional Court has been active in striking down legislation for violating the principle of equality. In fact, according to Article 3.1 of German's Basic Law, all persons shall be equal before the law. So basically, what does that mean? It means that the principle requires that the law accords equal treatment to matters that are essentially alike, and an equal treatment to such matters that are essentially different. So basically, from this principle derives an important requirement which must be met in order to impose a tax, which is the following. It must take into account the economic capacity of taxpayers. So in implementing this principle, the German court has established a doctrine that a taxation must be imposed in line with the ability to pay, the latter being applicable to both unequal burdens and unequal benefits. So in the case that we have analyzed, The court thus concluded that the bracket type design of the 1989 and 2006 taxation bylaws resulted indeed in unequal treatment. Why? For two main reasons. First of all, the brackets treat taxpayers with different economic capacities equally, subjecting all taxpayers within one bracket to the same absolute tax amount. However, it does not take into account that higher rental expenses typically correlate with greater economic capacity. And secondly, unequal treatment relates to the threshold between one bracket and the next in relation to the taxpayers whose net rent lies just above or just below the threshold between two brackets. So basically, by imposing a higher tax rate on the complainant, the tax scale places him in a less favorable position than taxpayers who rented a more expensive residence. Although the latter can be assumed to have greater economic capacity, they are taxed at a lower rate, amounting thus to unequal treatment within the meaning of Article 3.1. Additionally to the violation of the fundamental right to equality under Article 3.1, the court also brings up Articles 20.1 and 28.1, which basically treat and talk about Germans' duty to follow the welfare state principle, and thus require fiscal policy to show consideration for the need of the economically weaker groups in society.
So now I'm going to explain the justifications for breaching the economic capacity by the city of Konstanz and if the court accepted the justifications. Basically, both the court and the city raised three different justifications for breaching the economic capacity principle. The first one was administrative simplification, the second one was raising revenue, and the third one was a steering effect. Although Vio just explained what economic capacity is, I'm just going to give you a quick example so you remember it as I go through my presentation. Basically, it's just that those that have a higher capacity to pay shall carry a higher tax burden compared to those that have a lower capacity to pay and thus should have a lower tax burden. A breach would be the complete opposite, for example. How does the court measure this? They look at both the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension. In the horizontal dimension, it basically means that taxpayers that have equal economic capacity should be subjected to the same tax burden, while in the vertical dimension, it's basically that those that have a higher economic capacity should pay and should have a higher tax burden compared to those that are not as economically capable. So now we're going to look at the administrative simplification justification. Basically, administrative simplification allows for categorization and simplification requirements that can constitute an objective reason for the limitation of the principle of equality and thus that of economic capacity. The way that the tax scale was designed in 1989 with 5 different bases, or the one that was amended in 2002 and 2006 to include 8 generalizing brackets, can be a suitable mean. Because the way that the tax brackets are designed, it basically means that the authorities don't need to determine your exact annual rent on an individual case, nor do they have to verify when auditing you in case there are any reasons of doubt. The aim of the administrative simplification, however, does not cover the unequal treatment that stems from the specific design of this tax scale. And whilst unequal treatment may generally be justified by the necessity of administrative simplification in this specific case, it is not, because the design of the tax could be designed in another way that still fits the administrative simplification justification. Why? Well, I'm going to explain it. In absolute terms, those that are on the lowest end of the tax bracket, so those that have a secondary rent of 0 to 1,650, do pay the smallest and lowest tax amount at 400, compared to those on the other end of the spectrum, those that have the highest tax bracket that pay a little over 7,500. That pay a little over 7,500 in rent, and then in absolute terms, they pay 1,625 in tax amount. However, if we look at the tax percentage, this is where it becomes unequal, because those on the lowest tax bracket have the highest tax burden, as the tax amount is 37% of the average annual rent in average monthly rent in that tax bracket. While if we look at the other end of the spectrum, on the highest tax bracket, the tax percentage, even though the absolute tax amount is higher than that, than the lowest tax bracket, is in fact under, so 20% less than those on the lowest tax bracket, and then does not fit the economic capacity principle. Secondly, if you are in between tax brackets, so you're almost close to one or the other tax bracket, be it higher or lower, you're also at a disadvantage because you pay an absolute amount instead of a percentage. So the court found this another justification for not allowing the administrative simplification to be a justifiable breach. And then lastly, and the one that's seen the most and it's compounded, is if we look at the maximum and the minimums. Inside the minimum, I selected 500 because that's what the courts thought that was reasonable for a secondary residence monthly rent. And if we look at the tax amount, it's 409. Compare that to the highest in the same tax bracket, it would be 1,533. But look at the tax percentage. Inside the same tax bracket, there's almost a 30% difference in the tax percentage based on your rent to tax amount. While if you look at the other end of the spectrum on the highest tax bracket, I selected 15,000 because that's what the court thought was a reasonable highest tax bracket for the amount for the highest tax bracket to have as a secondary residence. If you look here, the minimum amount in that tax bracket is a little under 4,000. They pay the same absolute as the one that's 15,000. However, the difference in tax is huge. You could see the compounded effect of how the tax bracket was designed. While on the lowest end of this highest tax bracket, they pay 30%. Those that pay 15,000 only have to pay a little under 1%. And imagine if the secondary rent was 30,000 or 40,000, it would just compound the percentage even lower. So it would not be appropriate and would not follow the economic capacity principle. Therefore, although the administrative simplification can be a justification, it does not fit, because if you did the same tax brackets, however, if you did them in a progressive style instead of a degressive style, it would still achieve the same goals of administrative simplification, yet it wouldn't breach the economic capacity principle. And thus the courts found that this was not a valid justification. The second one was for raising revenues. The aim of generating higher tax revenues cannot justify by itself the unequal treatment stemming from the degressive tax scale either. The unequal burdens resulting from the specific design of the secondary tax does not justify it, in the sense that it doesn't matter even if the city or the municipality or the state require more financial needs or have a very strained budget, it cannot be justified. And hence, similar to the first administrative simplification, by having a progressive tax, it would still achieve the same raising revenues principle, yet it would not breach the principle of equality nor that of the economic capacity. And then lastly, we have the steering purposes. The courts identified 3 different steering purposes. The first one was to make sure that individuals registered their secondary residence to a principal residence. Another one would be to also increase the housing supply for the local population, and in particular those of the students of the local universities. And then thirdly, according to German law, the financial contributions under the fiscal equalization among municipalities are dependent on the number of inhabitants and thus the number of registered principal residents. And that's why they would prefer to have you switch from a secondary residence to a principal residence to increase their revenues. However, even in light of having certain margins for appreciation to breach the economic capacity, the steering purpose could be also done compared to the other 2 justifications in the same manner. If you do a progressive tax instead of a degressive tax. And then basically, so what happened? Was it justified or was it not justified? In this case, the court had to set a very strict standard on the legislative authority because they deviate so much from the capacity principle. And although the capacity principle does allow the municipality to design the specific tax scale in the manner that they think is the best, the Federal Constitutional Court has to set a very strict standard when examining the tax brackets, and to make sure that it does not exceed the constitutional limits in its design. Measured against these standards, the courts found that the taxation bylaws are no longer justified, be it for the simplification requirements or the raising tax revenues, or finally the steering purposes, as all of these taxes, all these justifications could be used if we did a progressive tax instead of a degressive tax.
Okay, so lastly, the court analyzes the proportionality of the legislation. So while imposing a tax on secondary residences may be suitable overall, so to encourage holders of a secondary residence to register the residence as a principal residence, the design of this digressive tax scale itself does not promote this purpose. So basically, the objective would be achieved in the same way, for example, by a linear or even a progressive tax scale, which would avoid the unequal treatment established in the present case. Furthermore, even considering the potential simplification the design of this tax could have for the administration, it still would be disproportionate to the benefits that the simplification may create, as it is limited to the fact of not having to determine the exact annual net rent in each individual case, and of not having to verify the rent in cases of doubt. So it's basically not enough as a simplification criteria. So thus, the court concludes that the proportionality of costs and benefits does not justify the unequal treatment caused by a digressive tax scale for expenditure taxes at the level of the municipality in the form of secondary residence taxes.
So in conclusion, the court's decision was that the bylaws were not constitutional. They were a violation of Article 3, Section 1 of the Basic Law, as they did not, as the tax did not tax according to economic capacity. And this unequal treatment required a justification which the court found did not exist to the level that was required. So the reasons of simplification requirement, the tax revenue raised, the legitimate steering, and the principle of equivalence were not significant enough to warrant the unequal treatment. Furthermore, the court also established that the challenged tax assessment issued by the defendant to the claimant was to be reversed.